Kia ora everybody. I have the honour of speaking with Geoff Simmons today. Geoff, you're the leader of the Opportunities Party and you guys have relaunched, isn't that right?
Yeah, you can just call us Top now.
Yeah,
It makes
awesome.
it easier.
Oh,
Kia
I
ora,
like
Ryan.
it. Yeah.
Yeah,
So you guys decided to go another round. Not done with yet.
absolutely. The whole point of the relaunch is to show a clear break with 2017 and present a brand and public face that's more aligned with our policies and values. We really are the party of young people and those who want real change, fundamental change, and so that was the thinking behind the rebrand, to actually get that across to people in ways other than through our policies, because policies kind of speak to the head, but branding and imagery and the way we talk is what speaks to the heart.
Absolutely. So I went on to the website and the header is confronting. Where was the decision to put some profanities up on there?
Well, I mean, it's that's all part of the new brand and look and feel. Like I said, we're angling for people who are interested in fundamental change, who are prepared to challenge the status quo, and those kinds of people are pissed off with the status quo and the kind of tinkering around the edges approach that we have. So what we're trying to do is tap into that sense of frustration, but also provide a sense of hope that things can be different. And I think to make sure that we don't come across like a bunch of earnest progressives. We've thrown in a dash of humour too, because we think that's really what's going to help get our message across, help people think differently about the status quo. So it's those three things together that really make up the emotional side of what we're trying to do.
You brought up that term, earnest progressives. I sort of see TOP as more of a pragmatic approach, whereas progressive has developed a new and quite sort of scary name to it, or association to it, where nothing's good enough and it's a race to cut everybody else off. Would you say that?
Oh, I mean, I would agree that's what I mean about being a bunch of earnest progressives. That's kind of where that where that movement has gone in recent years. And yeah, I mean, we think the country can be better, but yeah, we need to be pragmatic about it. I mean, in many ways, when I'm talking to business audiences in particular, or groups of small business or that sort of thing, the way I try to describe TOP is because people can see that what's happening in with Trump and Brexit, those sorts of things. I mean, that's not good for anyone. The sort of the rise of the populist, and everyone's getting hurt by that. Businesses getting hurt by that. Poor people in particular are the ones who get hurt by that. And it's a matter of saying, well, change is coming. Let's be progressive and front foot that, but not, otherwise this is what you'll get.
Mm-hmm.
That's the approach that I take with it anyway. You can either have, you can either have, radical now, or you can get extreme later on when you don't take care of these fundamental issues.
Yeah, no, and I guess that's probably why we are working at one end of the spectrum as in government, and the other end of the spectrum's screaming and yelling for help and reason, whereas when you say take a pragmatic approach, you can sort of add a bit of nuance to the conversation, see where everyone's coming from, and find say something that works for the for most people rather than the people with the loudest voice. Mate, you said you're sort of trying to address the frustration in the air, and one of those things is that there's so many people out there, especially my age. I managed to actually fill in my voting papers for the local electorate, so the next step is to put it in the post. But
congratulations.
Something like 40% of voter turnout. Do you sort of sympathise with the people that sort of think, oh well, nobody's voting, so I'm not making a difference? But really, it's the other way around, isn't it? If you do vote, your vote carries more weight.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. If when no one is voting, you do have a much greater say. I mean, I definitely can. I do have some sympathy for people that have disengaged from politics, because politics hasn't delivered for decades now. We've just, like I said before, we've sort of seen tinkering around the edges. Politicians who've made careers out of looking like they're going to do something about a problem without actually doing anything about it. And that has led to that sense of frustration I mentioned before when we're talking about, people switching off and disengaging. So yeah, I totally can see where they're coming from in checking out of the system entirely and not wanting to have anything to do with it. And that's really what that new branding I mentioned is trying to tap into, trying to re-engage those people. Say, look, we understand your frustration. We understand why you think politics is shit, because it has been shit. But it doesn't need to be shit. We can do things differently. And if we do things differently, then there is hope. And if we look overseas, you can see examples. There's no nirvana overseas, but in a number of countries, you can see examples of where certain things are done better than they're done here. And that's what we have to draw upon to show people that things can actually be different if we put our minds to it.
So what are some of the examples of that?
Well, one of the big ones, of course, is around housing and taxation, is something that we've talked about a lot as a political party. And, New Zealand has the most favourable tax system for housing in the world. We have more of our assets sunk into housing than any other country in the world. And we have some of the most unaffordable housing in the world. So it's kind of that kind of trifecta is not too hard to see why it is the way it is. When you look overseas, there's two broad ways of solving that issue. In some countries, what they do is they tax housing the same as all other assets, particularly retirement income, because for most people, your house and your retirement income are your two major lifetime assets. In New Zealand, most people, it's all housing, and your, in the past, your version of KiwiSave has been almost non-existent, because we just haven't had a retirement savings scheme up until very recently. So most countries in the world will do one or two things. They'll say, okay, we'll either tax housing at the same rate as we tax other forms of investment. So there's no disincentive to no incentive to invest in housing in terms of tax treatment, and there's no disincentive to invest in other investments. And that, broadly speaking, is one way of solving the problem. It means that you can bring in a lot more money because you're taxing housing, and it means you can reduce other forms of taxation. Of course, politically in New Zealand, that's a difficult story, because that would mean a conversation about taxing owner-occupied housing in particular. And, you could talk about having some thresholds for that, but if you don't tax any owner-occupied housing, I mean, that's half the wealth in the country will go untaxed. And, if you look at the countries that do that sort of thing, like Australia, where they put it that, you know, they've got a capital gains tax excluding the family home, and that just means people invest more in the family home because it actually increases the tax differential between the family home and all other assets. So you get what they call the mansion effect, which means you double down on putting all your money into the family home. So that's one approach that you see some countries do. The other approach is to say, well, okay, if we're not going to tax housing, then we won't tax retirement income either. And that kind of at least equalizes that from that perspective. So it means the choice between putting your money into a house and putting your money into retirement savings, like your KiwiSaver, basically, is removed from at least the tax part of it's removed, and so people are more likely to invest in KiwiSaver in those countries. And therefore, if you put your money into KiwiSaver, that most of that money ends up in businesses in some form. So you get more people investing in the economy, creating jobs and exports and all that sort of stuff, and less money going into housing speculation. So two broad different ways of dealing with that problem that you can see if you look around the world. The advantage of taxing housing, this is why we favour it rather than the same as other assets, is because it's much better for equity. It reduces wealth inequality by a huge amount. If you exempt KiwiSaver the same as you exempt the family home, that actually means that your inequality rises because it's giving people a tax-free place to invest, and it means that rich people are going to get richer. So in countries like that, that's why you see places like the Scandinavian countries having very high taxes on, progressive taxes on income. That's because that's to try and keep the wealth inequality down, because they don't tax KiwiSaver basically at all. So that if you are going to tax exempt KiwiSaver, then you have to offset that somehow in terms of inequality. So that's a problem that our proposal avoids, because if we just tax housing the same as all other assets, it's incredibly progressive, raises a lot of money, means we can reduce all other income taxes, and encourages people to invest in businesses rather than speculate on housing.
Yeah, and as someone who had a house and went to Australia for a year and dealt with all that rental market stuff and have sold it because now we don't live there anymore. We now live in Hawke's Bay, and then it comes to the rental market, and when you're paying more to rent than you are to own a house, it's sort of you feel a little bit off. And like I was telling my mum the other day, how much we're spending on rent, and so, wouldn't that be great if you're putting it into a mortgage? And yeah, that would be great, but like you said, we've sort of gamified the housing market, and I see that new ability for people to get into a house at 5% deposit at $400,000 cap means that minimum price for a house is $400K. The next step up is going to be probably 500 or high 400s, and as you said, we just keep pushing that up. We gamify our own housing market.
That's right. I mean, most of the things that the governments, that recent governments have done to so-called improve the affordability of housing have actually made housing more unaffordable. They've been taxpayer subsidies for property owners, basically. And but it looks like they're doing something for young people, when actually what they're really doing is lining the pockets of baby boomers who have put all their money into housing.
Yeah, and also it means that going back to investing in business, that means they're cash strapped to a 30-year mortgage, and and this is part of my thinking, when it comes to then investing in a business, it's like, well, shit, where the hell do I get capital from? Because I've had it all in a mortgage, or I'm not liquid, and all that sort of stuff.
Exactly, yeah. And and people, when small business owners hear about our ideas, that they say, well, but I've used my house to bankroll my business, to underwrite setting up my business. It's like, you know, what are you going to do about that? And I'm like, well, that's the point. Our whole economy has been based on housing. Even our business sector has been based on housing. And we're trying to break that. We're trying to break that link completely, so that there is more money available for actually investing in business, because that's the stuff that actually makes us richer. I mean, there's I don't know if you're familiar with Thomas Piketty. He's a French economist. No, okay. He wrote the book Capital, which was big a few years ago, in terms of which basically said, you know, the rich get richer, which is true to a large extent, but there's been a lot of work following on from that, and actually what they've found is that the countries that encourage investment in property as opposed to investment in business, while they look as rich, those are the countries, generally speaking, with much greater income, wealth inequality, because you're getting richer at someone else's expense. Whereas if you invest in business, that really does rise the tide for all boats, because you provide, businesses provide jobs and exports and all that sort of stuff. So you've got a much bigger chance of having a fairer economy. So yeah, there's quite a big difference between the countries that encourage housing speculation and the countries that encourage business investment.
So do we have a bit of a cash problem in New Zealand? I was talking to my brother the other day. He works for Sinlays. Of course he would say this, but he was talking about Fonterra being at like 48% credit or something like that. Do we have a cash problem over here? And that's part of the issue, and we'll get onto agriculture, but part of the issue with agriculture is there's a lot of wealth around, but not enough to nothing to spend. Is that, would you say?
Well, I mean, that's a whole whole other can of worms, but it also comes back to our tax system, in that the best way to make money in New Zealand is through tax-free capital gain for particularly for farmers. That's how they've made money in recent years. So the whole agricultural model is based around pushing up land prices rather than actually making money from selling meat and milk and wool and crops or whatever it is that you're growing. The whole agricultural sector has been set up around that, and Fonterra is another example that's been set up to enable that. I mean, there's good reasons for having a cooperative. There's good reasons for, if you're producing a perishable good like milk, there's good reasons for having a cooperative that can, make sure that you don't get ripped off, because if it was just a private sector, if someone turns up to pick up your milk, they'll say, well, we'll take it off your hands, but by the way, we're cutting the price in half, and the farm would be over a barrel, right? So there's reasons for having these things, but the way that Fonterra got set up, and farmers are very resistant to changing this, the way that Fonterra got set up basically says, right, we will make sure that the maximum amount of money goes to paying farmers for the milk, which sounds fine as a concept, but Fonterra was sold to us New Zealanders. We set up a monopoly, which is not good for us Kiwis, right? In terms of having a competitive price for milk, that's one, alongside the supermarkets. That's why people say, gosh, milk's more expensive here than in Australia. Well, that's one reason why. But the reason that we agreed as a country to allow farmers this monopoly was so that, look, at the story they sold us was that we're going to create all this wealth and we're going to invest it in value add, and Fonterra is going to become the next Nestle and whatever. And it hasn't happened. and that's because the way Fonterra was set up was to make sure that the maximum amount of money goes to farmers each and every year. So Fonterra has never really been able to accumulate the kinds of reserves to invest in research and development or invest in new markets. So they've stayed this commodity, producer. And to do anything, Fonterra's had to take on debt, which is why they're so in debt. And when you look at their balance sheet, most of the investments they've got themselves into have come through debt. And that works if the investment turns out to be good. But on average, most of their investments have turned out to be pretty average. So really, they haven't been able to cover much more than the than the cost of that debt. So yeah, I mean, Fonterra basically has been a failure, compared to what we were promised when it was set up. There hasn't been investment in new products or new markets. We're still mostly exporting milk powder to China, and and Fonterra's heavily indebted as a result. Who has done well out of Fonterra is farmers, because all of the money has been going back to farmers to pay for milk. That all ends up getting capitalized into land prices, and farmers can sell their farms for tax-free capital gain. So we don't see them making lots of money through selling wonderful products, but we do get them. They basically make their money when they retire through tax-free capital gain.
And then because sheep milk is slowly buying it off them. Still got a bunch of debt.
Well, exactly, and this is why it's a zero-sum game, right? Because getting rich through higher land prices or higher house prices, which is what our economy is set up to do, someone has to buy that. The next generation has to buy that, and so to keep yourself rich or to realize the gains, you've got to find a buyer. That means you've got to shackle someone with debt. And it's a zero-sum game at the end of the day. It's not like building a business which actually adds value and creates something that makes people better off. You're just enslaving future generations to pay for your inflated land prices.
Yeah, and so I guess that carries us on to them paying to fix up the water or something like that. How do we practically go about it when no one's got anything to spend?
Exactly. I mean, when you got that high levels of debt, it becomes very hard to. Basically, that's why I referred to the dairy boom in the late, part of the first decade. The late noughties, if you like. The massive dairy boom we had during those years, which, by the way, wasn't just under National, it was under Labour as well. The Helen Clark government. I referred to that as New Zealand's version of the GFC, because Canterbury and bits of Southland and bits of the central Waikato, around Taupo there, were converted into dairy. Large tracts of that land was not suitable for dairy, and we're seeing the impact of that in our water quality now. So the people that converted the land have had huge capital gain. They've sold the land, they've made their money. They're now retired in Winton or Christchurch or wherever, Taupo maybe. You see some of the mansions in those areas. That they've come from dairy money, and they've actually left land that isn't really suitable for dairy. And now that we've worked it out, now that we've seen the impact on our water quality, now the government has said, we have to clean up our water. in places like Canterbury, that's now coming home to roost, because we have to reduce dairy farming, or at least the amount of cattle on the land, by 80 or 90% to return water quality in Canterbury to what it was pre the dairy boom. Who's going to pay for that? Are the farmers going to pay in terms of, seeing their land values plummet? Hopefully they could find alternative uses for that land that won't reduce the land values by as much. We cross our fingers and hope for that, but that may or may not turn out to be the case. Or is the government going to pay to bail them out? Or is the government going to pay to put in, cow sheds everywhere? Because you can, if you keep cows off the land during winter, potentially you can reduce some of that leaching, but it's expensive. It costs $1,500 or $2,000 a cow. So that's a couple of $1 billion for Canterbury alone, given that they've got 1 million cows in Canterbury. So, or more than 1 million cows. So
I listened to Farming Show last 2 weeks ago, and that figure you said per cow, they were even talking $250,000 per cow. So
right,
even more
for barns.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, I guess it depends on what kind of tech you're talking about, but yeah, it doesn't come cheap. So it comes back to the question, who's going to pay for this transition? So that's a massive question that the government will face over the next 5 years if we're actually going to meet these freshwater goals. And the big stuff up is that this expensive land that we've been making money off bidding up the price of land, and that's made this transition really bloody hard. So we've actually shot ourselves in the foot by focusing on tax-free capital gain.
And so, do you think that having the land tax and the capital gain tax balances that? Do you think that directly affects the people that have bought this out of massive debt, or it balances out and that forces them to create more tangible income, more cash, as we were talking about before?
Yeah, I mean, that's the idea of this of our tax is to we don't want to crash the New Zealand economy overnight. We want to phase this in, and so you bring it in over time, and if you do it over, say, 10 to 15 years, then land prices could be kept pretty much at a flat nominal level. So you're not getting into negative equity, but kind of the inflation allows the real value of that land to get eroded away at 2 or 3% per year. And in 10 to 15 years, you can get back to having affordable land prices from the perspective of the dairy sector or housing.
Mm-hmm.
So that then encourages you to use that land productively, make sure that you're actually getting a return on it, rather than simply running things for the sake of capital gain. That's very much the intent behind that taxation reform.
Yeah, and we'll come back to agricultural sector and the environment, but how does that then reflect into the renting market?
Well, obviously renters would be better off overnight if you change the tax system, because what we're saying is that the owners of assets are undertaxed, and the people who are paying PAYE, wage and salary earners are overtaxed. So the 50% of New Zealanders who currently rent would be better off like that with our reforms. And when things are fully implemented over time, of course, house prices would go through a similar process as what I described with land prices there. they'd stabilize over a long period and become affordable again. It would really make it neutral between whether you owned or whether you rented, as it should be. I mean, if you want to own because you want to put down roots in a place, that's fine. If you want to rent because you are young and might want to go traveling in a couple of years, that should be fine too. I mean, it always kind of bugs me that we have this massive incentive to purchase property in New Zealand, and I end up having conversations with friends where I'm saying to them, well, it probably doesn't make any sense for you to buy a house, but because our tax system tells you to, you might as well. I mean, it's just a bit nutty that we favour that as if the only way to be a good person is by owning a house. But so that's kind of the one-off effects. But the really big effect for renting is a dynamic effect. So you get more of an incentive to invest in property, invest in not in building new properties, but also making sure that properties are of a higher quality. Because if you want to improve your return on a property, you have to invest in it to get a better return back. The other dynamic impact on that is because house prices stop rising off into the sunset. Rents will stop rising too, and we can make housing in its broader sense, either to own or to rent. We can make it affordable again, and the benchmark for that is that the cost of housing should be less than 30% of your income, and we are a long way from that right now. For a lot of Kiwis are a long way from that right now. So that's why housing is the biggest creator of poverty in New Zealand. It has been for the last 20 years. We actually have pretty good income inequality in New Zealand. People when you compare incomes in New Zealand to overseas, sure, we're a bit poorer in New Zealand, but that's because our productivity is crap, which, there's a number of reasons for that, including that we put a lot of money into housing. But the spread of incomes isn't that bad in New Zealand. The real problem is that if you own a house, you're way better off, and if you don't, you're stuffed in New Zealand. That's the real cause of inequality.
What you were saying about how for the renter as well, that it raises the standard of what you're paying for. Does it also mean that as an owner of rental properties, if you wanted to lower your personal tax, you offset that with some expenses, which would be reinvesting into your asset? Is that another way that sort of motivates a better standard of living?
Yeah, I mean, if you if you want to, so if you are getting a certain if you're getting a certain well, it depends. If you're getting a certain income on, I mean, what the tax does is it says if you've got an asset worth $1 million, that asset has to be paying at least as much tax as a bank deposit. So at the moment, bank deposits are about 3%. Tax on that's about a third, say. So basically 1% of the value of that asset each and every year is your tax, right? So if you've got $1 million asset, about 1% of that is $10,000 per year. So if you are if you have that $1 million asset and you're at the moment you are only declaring enough income on it to pay about $5,000 in tax, then we'll say no, you got to pay at least $10,000 tax on that particular asset. So it gives you that incentive to make sure it's used productively, and that you get, that you get the income required from it to, to pay that return. So land bankers would get hit. If you've got a bit of land that's sitting around that you're not using because you're just waiting for the value to go up, you'd have a pretty strong incentive to build on it. And there's quite a big group of people who are effectively land banking because they have underutilized housing. So we know that in the last census, I think it's about 8% of houses in Auckland are empty. So this is our busiest, our most in demand, property market in the country. And what's that? 1 in 12, 1 in 13 houses are actually empty at any point in time. And we're not talking the owners have gone on holiday. We're talking for long periods of time here. So, there's a number of reasons why that might be the case, but a lot of that is also land banking, just basically, waiting for the value to go up, either for development or just to take the capital gain. And then you got people like my parents, who are in a completely inappropriate house in the centre of Auckland. It's a massive family home with 2 spare bedrooms, and that's actually, we could easily house all of the homeless in Auckland in the homes that we've already got, and make sure everyone still had a spare bedroom. That's the scale of underutilized housing that we have in New Zealand. So, that's just in Auckland. So, encouraging people to use their property more effectively. If you're not using the house, downsize, move along, or Airbnb it, or whatever. Get your mum to move in, or whatever you need to do to use those assets more effectively. That sort of tax does give that incentive to do all of that.
So then going to the UBI, does that cause a similar pressure of, well, people have got this amount of money, so therefore they can cover this cost, and so that's my minimum cost? Do you think that's going to...
You mean for rent? Would it push up rent?
Yeah, would it push up rent if we were to give somebody a UBI, universal basic?
Yeah, under the current system, it would. Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's part of the problem with the current system. You can't do these reforms in
silos.
In one-offs. Yeah, exactly. And we saw that with the accommodation supplement, right? I mean, Labor brought in boosts to the accommodation supplement in its first budget, and landlords said, yeah, thanks very much. Rents popped up by almost exactly the same amount. I mean, it was remarkable. It was remarkable that impact that came through almost straight away. I don't think we've ever seen such a blatant sign of the market power in the rental industry in our biggest cities. Students get more money, we'll put up rents for students by the same amount. And I mean, it's pretty terrifying. But that's because landlords are in this situation of having such market power, because the supply is so constrained. So we do need to free up supply, and the tax reform is part of that. But we are going to propose a housing supply policy as well, which will free up supply for housing, particularly in our inner city areas, and that has to be part of the solution, because then landlords don't have that ability to just to say, well, the supply is basically fixed. The supply of housing is fixed in this inner city. Your willingness to pay has gone up by $50, so our rent goes up by $50. You know, it's that's really crap.
So how do we do it differently, the supply thing? Because that's what's supposed to have happened this last 2.5 years. How do we do that differently?
with Kiwi Build, you mean? Well,
Yeah.
I mean, the government doesn't need to be putting on its Bob the Builder tool belt. You know, there's stuff that government does, and there's stuff that the private sector does. The private sector's pretty good at building housing in general, as long as the government gets the fundamentals right. And I mean, like I said, we'll be putting out a policy on that. But you know, you have to look at the resource management. You know, how new developments get approved and the cost of doing that. We have to look at the cost of building supplies, which are 30% higher in New Zealand than they are in Australia, and that's basically because we have a duopoly. We have Carters and Fletchers who've got us over a barrel because they, you know, effectively can influence government regulations, and because we have really crap competition laws in New Zealand, gives them excessive market power. So the combination of factors there leading to building supplies being really expensive. I mean, those are big aspects of it. There's a few other bits and pieces we need to reform, but we'll be putting out some views on that late this year or early next year.
Nice. So something that I work in, and that's health, and that's where we've been connecting a little bit over Twitter, mostly via what Grant Scover is doing with Precure, and that's around trying to influence preventative medicine. And like you said before, none of the policies work in silos. So when it comes to UBI and having, you know, the people that are most at risk of poverty, those with children under 5, having, you know, that weight off their shoulders for their children to go to daycare so that they can earn an income, they can feed nourishing food, they can feel good about themselves, have great well-being. You know, what would you love to see from our health sector? Which one's under the pump? And again, we roll out a medical school in Hamilton when we're crying out for rural doctors. It's like, oh, come on. You know, is that something that TOP's keen on, getting more doctors keen on rural environments? And, you know, there's lots to go.
Well, I mean, we have to shift our entire medical system, you know, from the hospital-based model to a much more community-based model. And, you know, the major parties have been talking about that again for a couple of decades and haven't really done anything to put it in place. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, rural doctors are a big part of that, but I would just say, you know, health needs to be much more community based in general. People have to be thinking about and interacting with you know, health on a day-to-day basis, rather than just when something goes wrong and when they're forced to go to the hospital. And there's all sorts of great tech that's coming our way that we can put in place in that regard. But again, none of that's going to matter much unless we have a much greater, you know, community workforce that can help people manage their own health, take responsibility for their own health, and understand what they can do to prevent all these issues. I mean, it's going to take a pretty massive cultural and structural change, and it'll take a cultural change amongst the population too, because I think most people have just sort of got used to the idea of that they do whatever they like and you know, worry about it later on. And you know, if you know, with the sorts of stuff that Grant's into on the nutrition side, I mean, people sort of get really antsy about being told what to eat, say it's my choice and all that sort of stuff. Well, that's fine, but on the other side of that, you can't then expect the health system to pick up the pieces if you're not prepared to take responsibility for your own health. So we've got quite a big conversation to have as a nation there. Do we, are we going to encourage people to eat more healthily, live more healthy lifestyles? And if we're not, then how do we get them to take responsibility for that when stuff goes wrong? I mean, that's historically been a massive issue with things like smoking, right? We weren't able to get people to take responsibility for it. We couldn't refuse people treatment when they turned up to the hospital with smoking problems. So that's when we started working on reducing smoking rates. And I think, obesity is now overtaken, well, not obesity per se, but nutrition in general. Obesity is probably the biggest part of it, but nutrition in general has taken over as the issue, the health issue of the 21st century. It's bigger than smoking now in terms of impact, and we have to deal with that.
I think the irony of what you said there about, you can't tell me what to eat and all that sort of stuff. Well, actually, a lot of what you do think is okay to eat and fun to eat is being told to you through the media machine and the PR machine of the food industry. So, yeah, again, hard pill to swallow when it comes to manipulating a population to be healthy and more productive. And
yeah,
I think the scary thing is when it comes to metabolic syndrome, it has the capacity to bankrupt not just us, but most Western countries.
I listened to I don't know if you've heard this, but it was, who was it? Oh, it was on Freakonomics Radio. I don't know if you're an avid podcast listener, but they did a thing on agricultural subsidies and where they came from and the impact the modern impact of agricultural subsidies. And anyway, it's a long story, but basically all of these subsidies came about for a variety of reasons, but as a result of them, they ended up with these stockpiles of wheat and corn. And that's when the nutrition guidelines, all of a sudden that pyramid appeared, which had the cereals at the bottom, the old, the apocryphal nutrition guidelines, which say, bread and all the cereals should be eaten. Yeah, the most. And it's like, actually, the reason for that was because they had stockpiles of it in the US, which is pretty damn insidious.
It's a bit like your margarine as well. Something to do with sewing machines and not having a use for the world anymore. So they made Crisco, and then we got margarine, and butter's bad.
Yeah. It's pretty terrifying, that sort of stuff. So you are dealing with a whole bunch of misinformation out there, but I mean, generally speaking, we know what allows people to be healthy, and it's fairly straightforward, and the same stuff that works for mental health works for physical health too, and we need to get that across to people,
Yeah, and you bring up a good point there, and it's part of the reason for the success of what we're seeing with the likes of CrossFit and the likes of F45, that mental health and community health and environment drives a lot of people, both their accountability and to their sort of response to a good feeling, a good health and a good lifestyle.
Absolutely. It's one of the enduring things about humans that I find morbidly fascinating is that over the past 100 years we have had more choice than ever before, and yet we've chosen to use that that freedom to isolate ourselves more and more from other humans when that all the evidence shows that that's actually a major source of our happiness and well-being. It's quite a bizarre situation. Yeah.
And of course, the reason why we feel quite depressed about that is because if you're by yourself, from a historical perspective, you're not in a very good place, and you should be motivated to get out of that funk, I guess.
Yeah.
And staying with the health, and it's something that I said I wanted to have a chat to you about, and I saw your sort of cannabis reform is more around alcohol reform, which I thought was quite a good tactic, but something that is already available in somewhat a perspective. I think the only reason to write a prescription for CBD oil is for MS. But is there any scope within TOP for greater research into, a non-psychoactive derivative of cannabis and hemp and CBD oil for helping a broader spectrum? I know, talking to guys in Australia, they can prescribe it for chronic pain and for migraines and Parkinson's. I think the key point is to have the conversation more nuanced and more open, and especially with the amount of evidence that's now compiling. Is it time to have that conversation?
Oh, for sure. And this is a major reason why we actually back legalization, because what you see in in the United States and Canada is that it's so hard to keep your medical regulations and all that system up to date with the latest evidence and what works and what works for someone doesn't work for someone else. That in the end, a lot of these medicinal cannabis regimes just end up getting abused. If they're effective, they end up getting abused because they're so liberal that you can go along and say, well, I've got writer's cramp or I've got a headache and that I need to get rid of, so can you prescribe me some cannabis? And it just becomes a farce. That's certainly what happened in California. Things just got so farcical. I forgot what percentage of the population had cannabis cards by the end of it. Yeah. And people, I think we just have to treat people with a little bit of respect and like they're adults. I mean, cannabis is less harmful than alcohol by a long way. It has all sorts of benefits that we're only just starting to understand. Those benefits come from various balances of CBD and THC, and I understand that the science is getting even more sophisticated than simply talking about balances between CBD and THC as well. I'm not hugely up on that stuff, but those sorts of flavonoids, I think people are talking about now. Anyway, this is what I mean. This sort of stuff is so incredibly sophisticated. I think we just need to trust people to work out what's best for them and let them get on with it. When we're not talking about something that causes a great deal of harm, and in fact, we're talking about reducing harm really by regulating it, legalizing it, regulating and taxing it.
And something further you guys are pushing the boundary of is genetic, using genetics for positive good, not giving a rat, sterility, but, just changing one or two things and creating a better world.
Yeah. I mean, so genetic modification has come a long way in the last, 15 to 20 years. We had a Royal Commission on it back in the early 2000s, and probably where they came to was broadly right, and that's how we got the situation we've got now. It has been implemented in a very risk-averse way, but as the GM technology has developed, we think of genetic modification as taking genes from one thing and shoving it in another one, like taking carrot genes and putting them in a sheep to make an orange sheep or something.
Franken genes,
yeah. And that sort of stuff, yes, it does happen, but the gene editing stuff is far more sophisticated than that, and it's really just talking about going into an existing gene and just tweaking things, turning genes on and off, in the same way that natural selection or selective breeding does, to accentuate certain characteristics. This is how through thousands of years we've developed the different breeds of dog that we have, or the different breeds of cow that we have, that produce different kinds of milk and all that sort of stuff. And really what gene editing is saying is, well, we face a huge number of challenges with climate change, with freshwater problems, with Cody dieback, that sort of stuff, predator free, as you already mentioned. And can we just use this idea of selective breeding, but speed it up through this gene editing tool to sort of say, well, we just want to select for this characteristic, so we're just going to turn this gene on. And it's a hell of a lot safer than the old type of genetic modification, taking one thing, shoving it in another, which, like I said, generally speaking, I think we've managed that in a pretty reasonable, slightly risk-averse way, but that's probably fair enough. But this new technology is incredibly safe. The issue, the issues with it are no greater than any form of selective breeding that we already carry out. It's just a hell of a lot faster and allows us to deal with these challenges.
Yeah. And so do you think as a country, whilst there might not be the need for it right now, but we're just in Hawke's Bay, they stopped the Ruataniwha Dam. Do you think that there's a discussion to be had about nuclear power as well, or do you think that we'll stay with renewables till the end of New Zealand?
I've talked to, and I think we have to be open to this conversation going forward. But I've talked to quite a number of people about about the issue of nuclear power, and it doesn't really fit New Zealand's power demand profile at the moment, because it does play a similar role in a system as hydro does. If these hydro dams eventually need to be replaced or decommissioned, and we need to replace them, then perhaps that'll then become a conversation for us. But right now it isn't, and certainly I don't think we should be allergic to nuclear power just because it's nuclear power. We have a bigger challenge now in climate change to take care of. But yeah, I don't see us having that conversation short term just because of the power profile that we demand that we have.
Yeah, no, it's I think it's baby steps when it comes to a lot of these things, and just for a start, having a conversation is the tough part. As sort of top, you guys are quite keen on the information and having case examples to back up what you're talking about.
Yeah.
How do you then sort of look at we've got sort of two extremes of government making a lot of noise, and we've got Acton versus Greens quite a lot of the time, and it's lots of investigation, lots of committees, lots of government departments versus just let it all work out for itself and leave us alone to get on with it. Where does top sort of stand in that sort of government for government's sake versus the private market for, I don't know, productiveness? stakeholders?
I mean, I think it's a horses for courses. The answer is horses for courses, and it's a matter of what works. And you look at different industries, the private sector does well, and in others it completely fails. I mean, I think largely the approach of having a public sector, public health sector, is broadly right. Same with education. I don't see any massive need to challenge those aspects. I mean, I think what I would say, and I don't want to sound this might start sounding Tony Blair by talking about a third way, but this isn't what Tony Blair was really talking about with the third way. But I think the really big future for New Zealand, that we don't do a lot of, and we should do more, is actually bringing in the community sector. Government does a lot in New Zealand, and that doesn't necessarily need to be that way. And actually, when you look at the undertakings we made with the Treaty of Waitangi, the increasing calls for rangatiratanga, that really lends itself to a conversation about devolving responsibility too, devolving responsibility to community groups, to iwi, to local councils, that sort of stuff. I mean, I think, as we've discussed, I think health should be much more located in the community. I think, in particular, mental health is something that should be embedded in the community a lot more, because there isn't actually great evidence on what works to improve people's mental health. The one thing that is clear from the evidence is that different things work in different areas. And that's because of all that stuff we talked about before. It's all about getting people to do the basics that we all know. The hard part is actually getting people to do that stuff, right? And so actually different, in some areas it might be a CrossFit group like you mentioned. In some areas it might be a kapahaka group that gets people exercising and interacting with other people and proud of their identity and spending time in nature and eating better and all that sort of stuff. There's been some great work done with church groups in South Auckland about nutrition. All that sort of stuff is I think what works in different places is going to be different. The other example I'd give of that I can really see is around housing. So we have a incredibly centralised social housing model in New Zealand with Housing New Zealand. We have a few fledgling community housing organisations. We have some iwi dabbling in providing housing. But what you see overseas is a much bigger role for the community housing sector. So these are charities, local groups that provide housing for particular communities. And they provide a variety of housing too, because you kind of have social housing here and owner-occupied housing here. Then you have renting in the middle, but then there's kind of this all this grey area around affordable housing and all that sort of stuff. A lot of room for innovation in there, and for a lot of different communities to deliver things in different ways. So I think there's huge scope in New Zealand for encouraging the community housing sector to innovate in that space and provide some different tenures and different affordable housing options.
Okay, that's revolution, a third way of doing things. Yeah, I like it. So, mate, you rebranded. Where do people find Top?
Top.org.nz is the website. Facebook.com/TopNZ is the Facebook page. That's where you'll find a lot of a lot of stuff that we're up to. We're on Instagram, we're on Twitter, we're on YouTube. We do quite a lot of stuff on YouTube, because video is the thing these days. And it's really social is massive for us, social media, because and we do have regional coordinators. We have people in most regions of the country. If you want to get in touch and meet people in real life and talk about these sorts of issues, we have people all around the country that are organising events like that, and hosting events like that. So again, you can find that out through getting in touch on social media or through our website. We're building that team for 2020, but really it is, it's a movement. The whole idea is that this, TOP is now 100% funded by our small donors, our supporters, and 99% of the work is done by our dedicated and talented group of volunteers. So we really are a movement, and if people want to get involved, then all hands on deck. We definitely need to show that people really want fundamental change.
And if they're looking to follow you, just the Twitter handle?
Twitter, Geoff Simmons, and Facebook's the same, Instagram's the same. So it's Geoff Simmons, but with a Z at the end. So GeoffSimmonz. And I'm on most of the socials. Not Snapchat yet though. I have got my head around that.
Chuck some filters through your face, hey? Okay, mate. So thank you so much for your time. I can imagine it's been a busy one, especially with relaunching last Thursday. What would you like to leave people with? It's maybe a thought that hasn't done you any damage, or something that you'd like people to consider and take forward.
Oh, look, I mean, the thing that I've been thinking about most lately is really, because we're focusing on fundamental change, the most common response you get to that is, people don't, I don't like change. And, ultimately, that's what the majority of the population is like, which is why we're in the pickle we're in right now. And my response to them is, if you don't like change, you're going to like irrelevance even less. The stuff that Top's talking about is coming down the pipeline, and it's going to hit us for better or for worse. So better to front foot it.
Absolutely. I love it, mate. We'll press stop there, and thanks so much.
Thanks, Ryan.